So a little bit about me. I'm Siddharth. I'm head of product at the startup called Moonlake. We're just in stealth, and we've raised about 30 million to build agentic tools for people to build 3D worlds. But how all of that started is this little project I did called Blender MCP. So I have some history with Blender because outside of my day job as a product person, I love creating. So I love making music. I love making games, making 3D design. And so I stumbled onto Blender about a few years ago, and I absolutely struggled with it. But before I get ahead of myself, what is Blender exactly? So Blender is just a general 3D creation suite for, modeling, rigging, animation. So a lot of people come here to make their 3D models for games, or architects come to make, models for buildings and so on and so forth. Um, and this is what the UI looks like. So it's no surprise that it's a really hard thing to use. It took me about weeks to get a hang of it to even make something I had imagined. And this is a very famous intro tutorial to anyone who's ever done 3D design, which is a beginner Blender tutorial. And this is a 5-hour tutorial, and it takes even longer to make. And essentially, it is just a donut, right? It should not be taking this long. And I kept thinking, does it really have to be this hard to be creative? That you really need to learn a tool for weeks to actually make something that you have in your head. And so when I saw the MCP documentation for the first time, I thought that, okay, can this actually break down the barriers of entry to something as complex as Blender, right? Can anyone who has an idea in their head about making something in 3D use Blender without having to learn Blender for weeks? Because I struggled with it. I knew how it, what it felt like, and so to test that out, I essentially created this small video. And so you can see there's Claude on the side, and I'm just prompting it to create a dragon, a dungeon. And there's no human input from my end, right? It's just controlling Blender, and it completely makes this dragon, right? And so I expect this to um, didn't expect this to blow up, but it's now at about 300,000 downloads. It's about 13,000 stars on GitHub. I think what it reaffirmed for me was that how many people are inherently just creative and want to be creative, but haven't been able to just because the tools are so hard. And so just a little bit behind the scenes of this before we get into how people have been using it. I think a lot of people today have covered what how MCP works, just a little bit of an overview of how the Blender MCP in specific works, right? So straightforward, there's a server, which is the client, and there's Blender, and there's also external APIs, essentially, right? So what Blender does is it has a bunch of tools that it surfaces to the server, which is, it says, I can execute Python scripts, I can make a cube, I can share my scene information with you. There's the external APIs which say I can provide assets, I can give some nice lighting and HDRIs and some nice rigging, right? And there's the client which tries to understand what tools I can use to make all of this happen. So when I say I want to make a dragon, it's essentially getting all of this information and trying to make the right decision on what to do. So almost like a very simple agent in a way, right? And it's this orchestrator which needs to kind of figure out what to do. And so in a way, there's a lot of problems with context and making sure the tools are mutually exclusive and exhaustive, and so that this all comes together, and a lot of testing, as a lot of people mentioned today. um, but I think what I find more exciting than the actual technology is what people use it for, because what's interesting about creative tools, I've been using creative tools pretty much all my life, and I love the space. But I think what's surprises me almost every time with creative tools is when you put it in oops, when you put it in people's hands, what they actually use it for. So this came out, and people use it for 3D scenes. So this is a scene actually I created in like 2 minutes, and I said I wanted a nice cute night scene with fantastical magical animals. So this is what it made for me. um, People have been using reference images So something like this, where, oops, yeah, so something like this. They put in an image of a cat, and then uh, they prompt it a little bit more to put it on a sofa, and then they create the final scene of this cat animating. Um, Examples like this, right? These are people who've never done 3D before, and now they're making these low poly cabins, aeroplanes, this cute cafe with animals inside it, this farm, right? And also something like this. Essentially, what's happening here is it provided a reference image of an isometric view of a room, and the MCP is just using that. They're using Cloud to do this essentially. And so you can see how it works pretty well. People have been using it for creating terrain for their games and their maps. So they provide this reference image, and yeah, it calls the right things and makes this cool Mars looking terrain for you. And you can almost imagine exporting this out to a game, right? And playing it. They've been using it to create assets, something like this zombie asset, which I think is pretty cool. So they provided this image and they got this out of it. And something I find very interesting is also game creation. Someone used Blender to create the entire levels for their games, use the MCP. And this is someone who's, by the way, never coded before or never used 3D software before. This is the first time they're creating a game. And they've had this idea for this game for 6 years, which is they wanted to collect rib fragments to complete the rib. And they were finally able to do it with the help of, all these creative tools that are available, including the MCP. Other cool examples, people have been using it for animation, like the cat animation, which I just showed a little bit while ago. But also something like this, where this is just a one shot. People created crystal cubes and had a camera animate around it, something super simple. And also, outside of this, what's really interesting to me is that people have been using this in combination with other tools. So if you look at something like this, so this person used the MCP to create a racing track, right? And so they built a racing track. Now they add race cars to it, which are animated also through the MCP. And then they create a camera to follow, to also animate using the MCP, right? And then what's really cool is they record this scene, and they put it into a video diffusion model in just a bit. Yeah, so this is the scene they captured. And then they put it into a video diffusion model, and it looks something like this. And so you kind of see how these different tools now start interacting with each other, right? And how someone who would have taken like billions of dollars to make this earlier is now able to do this pretty easily, and the cool thing is they have really good control over this as well. 3D printing is another one that's really big. This was a post on Reddit where someone just said make a plan for a water bottle holder, and it made it, and they actually printed it out, and it worked. So so many different ways in which I never imagined this would work is now being used by people, right? And so now back to the donut tutorial, which took 5 hours. Obviously, people were going to recreate that, and this took like a minute to make. Maybe not as good as what the tutorial would get you to, but I think it's a good starting point. And so, generally, what I've been seeing is just MCPs are changing how creators achieve their goals, and I think for me that's probably the most important problem that I see myself working on for a while. And remember when I talked about the server being this kind of orchestrator, and I just showed you one tool. So imagine what happens when you're orchestrating multiple different tools. I could say something like make a game, and then the Cloud Cloud Code or whatever you're using as the client talks to Blender, talks to Ableton, which is a music software, and Unity, which is a game engine, and essentially ties these together to make a game for you. So just as an experiment, I tried this out, where I prompted make a dragon and also make a soundtrack for it, like a villain soundtrack. And so you can see So you can see that soundtrack's not winning any Grammys, but I think it's actually a little bit insane that it's controlling two different tools at one time. It understands the context between each. It's understanding that I need to create a dragon in one tool, but I also need to make a villain as soundtrack. It's even crazier to me that it actually understands the complexity of these tools, selects the right sound, puts the right sound in the right tracks, plays them, understand what like an evil soundtrack would sound like. So I think it's actually a little bit crazy. And so I've been thinking a lot about like this experiment. I think raised a lot of questions for me about how humans are going to be interacting with AI specifically to create things. And that's what I'm exploring right now, even with my present startup. Right, I think it's some really interesting questions around: is it going to be tools talking to each other? Like if you ask for a game, how is it going to orchestrate that? Do people even need to learn complex UI anymore? There's always a trade-off between flexibility. I think that's reducing now with MCPs. And our creator is going to be more like orchestra conductors. We're conducting all these different agents to do what they want and still maintain that intent. So I think, me personally, I feel like a creative renaissance is kind of coming. I want to believe that, being a creator, and I really feel that because it's never been easier to create something. And so, imagine someone in their bedroom making the next blockbuster movie or game. I think that's totally going to be possible soon. And so I personally love nerding out in this area. If someone's interesting, please reach out to me. This is my Twitter. This is my GitHub if you want to check out the project. There is no official website, so if you see any website online that's not mine, this GitHub is the only official way to try out Blender MCP. So if anyone wants to do that, go ahead. And thank you.
Wow, that was amazing. Thank you so much. It does really get across the frontier of that MCP provides, where people like you are building a tool that then can be used by much less experienced people to build amazing experiences. And so it really is a renaissance. I think, I remember like the beginnings of mobile when there were thousands of downloadable apps, and eventually there were millions. Of course, that's going to lead to a search problem when there are millions of MCPs out there. But that's a problem for the future. And my goodness, that was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you.